Salams, my name is Mira Nair. I'm a filmmaker, and I'm very pleased tonight to be speaking to Shaunak Sen, who is an extraordinary filmmaker, making the wonderful, really mesmerizing film All That Breathes, a documentary that is up for the Best Documentary at the Academy Awards and a slew of other prizes. But a very rare film, so I'm most excited tonight to ask him how he made this film and how he thought of this film. And we both are from New Delhi. I happen to be living in New Delhi right now, and he's living in my other home, New York, right now. And we have played musical chairs. I should tell you that his film, All That Breathes, is available on HBO and will be showing at HBO and HBO Max and is up for the Academy Awards. Thank you. So here's Shaunak. Shaunak, welcome to the other side of the world.
Thank you, Mira. It's surreal talking to you, with you in New Delhi and me here. Also, thank you so much for doing this. It's really an honor.
No, because you make us look at the world in a way that I have not yet seen in All That Breathes. It is an interconnectedness of the world, of the earth and the sky, literally. And you do it in a way that is cinematically exhilarating, but also makes me just puzzled as to how it actually began. I should tell those who have not seen the film, All That Breathes, well, you can talk about what it is, but I really was struck by the filmmaking style. Besides the philosophy that was spun in the most poetic and unpretentious way through the course of these two extraordinary brothers and their assistant, who is absolutely extraordinary also, who look after and heal kites and birds in the Delhi sky. And I look at them every day and I marvel at how you thought of this film.
Well, when you live in Delhi, especially during the winters, as you can tell now, one is always preoccupied with the air, right? The air is a constant wallpaper in our lives. And you're constantly thinking about the gray, oppressive expanse around you and that you're constantly breathing in, right? So I was also alongside that interested philosophically in human, non-human entanglement. So I wanted to do something vaguely on the trifecta of air, birds, and humans, very vaguely. And like I'm sure, I expect it probably is the same thing with you, where before anything, the film comes as a kind of tone or a texture, like a glow at the back of your head, right? And before anything with characters or anything. So unlike a documentary where you meet a character and then you say, this guy's life is interesting, and you sort of soldier on from there. Here I was more interested, like the thing that came to me first was this kind of a thematic scaffolding of, or a tone, really. And what came to me initially was really the style. Like I wanted to do, like those slow track-ins and all of that. So, and then the thing is that I Googled where do birds that fall off the sky go to, and the singular and brilliant work of the brothers obviously jumps out. And once
Mhm.
you visited that basement, that damp, industrial, grubby basement, it's inherently just so cinematically riveting. It reminded me of Tarkovsky and Bellatar and that world of things. So, and then it's like we shot the film for 3 years, and it just becomes a fever dream, right? It just like,
Yeah.
it's like jumping off a cliff, and before you know it, it just like you see the world through the demon eyes of the film, and it just takes over wholly. So that's what happened. And so we spent about 3 years shooting it, and the style sort of organically evolved.
So you didn't have the style. I mean, that is what I come from cinema verite. That's how I started to make
Yes.
films. I worked
Yes.
with Ricky Leacock and Penny Baker, and that cinema verite, the cinema of truth, is what guided me and my camera. And again, like you said earlier, you find a character, you work with the character, you hang out with the character for a year, and that character takes you on a journey that becomes the story. But here, you said you had a feeling, like almost like in fiction, you have
Yes.
a feeling for the texture and for the almost, I think, meditative quality because it is
Yes.
remarkable in
Yes.
your. So if you start with that, so how did you meet the brothers right off as a way of hanging your coat on
Yes.
these characters, and
Yes.
then did you bring that style that you have, that extraordinary first shot that is just like amazing, really fills me with wonder, and which connects all almost the living creatures, and especially in our city of Delhi, where literally under a puddle of water there could be
A
it's just a
universe.
subterranean ocean of
Yes.
insects.
Yes, we
Um,
hung our coats very rapidly, really, because essentially the first characters that we met for research were Nadeem and Saud, and we never met anybody else. But having said that, you're absolutely right in, the prefatory glow, the initial thought behind it was actually far more than what I imagine a general verite documentary usually
mhm,
entails. My previous film, a film called Cities of Sleep, which was made on sleeping,
mhm.
actually was far more ruggedly, like raw verite, classic
Yes,
documentary.
yes,
This film, I always wanted it to be more intentional and aesthetic in shape, because you see, the legacy of films that I was interested in was a totally different legacy. This was not the world of penny bakers, and that's a whole different
yes.
trajectory of things. Were
That's the
also
whole thing. Yeah, yeah.
monumental heroes of mine, but this was meant to be different. So actually, ironically enough, the first 6 months I was shooting handheld, and that, whether you like it or not, imparts a kind of restless, anxious vibe to your camera, because
Yep.
the camera person gets embodied in a felt and fleshy way in the camera. But
Mhm.
then, because the characters are just so meditative and contemplative, that I realized after a while that I had to let go of the 6 months of shooting and unfortunate two hard drives full of material, and start
Yep.
anew with a new style, which was more tripoded. And then over time, I realized we were moving towards what felt like a fiction toolkit, like
Yes.
sliders and cranes and all of that kind of stuff. The good thing is that this was a tiny space where we were shooting in the basement,
Mhm.
and the same action patterns would get repeated every day, which allowed me to anticipate and orchestrate camera movements.
Oh, I
And it
see.
had to be meditative, it had to be beautiful. That's the main thing. It's like it had to be
Yep.
beautiful, and it had to make us contemplate something that was more sublime than everyday quotidian life. It had to jump from the banalities of everyday
Mhm.
mundane life and zoom out into something bigger. So it had to be beautiful. The other thing is that the form, basically, with the cinematographers Ben and Riju, it started with a simple idea. We had to articulate the notion of simultaneity,
Mhm.
kinship or neighborliness between human non-human life. And you and I can talk about it, or I can write a thesis about it, but nothing communicates it better than one pan or a tilt. One long 2 to 3 minute shot, which say shows a turtle scurrying through
Yep.
traffic, and through trash, and the traffic zipping in the background. That sort of shows the how life is stapled, like jostling cheek by jowl in the city, and different temporalities coexisting like nothing else. So that sort of languid, slow style organically evolved with, like, it began with this kind of an idea. But yes, I wanted to push. I did not want it to be just regular verite. It had to be
Mhm.
a sort of creative treatment of actuality. Where there's verite, like the real life is just springboard, and then you jump off and transform it with an aesthetic container or a outer shell that is your style of telling, your grammar of telling.
And also embodies everything you want to tell, like making it a poetic, philosophical. Like I imagine you must have interviewed the brothers over
Yes.
months, right?
Yes, extensively,
Culled,
extensively. Yes.
culled from them
Yeah, yeah,
the
exactly.
poetry that becomes almost like a not a voiceover in the traditional sense, but their soul. So
Yeah,
that
so
must, yeah,
exactly. So the thing is that with the voiceovers, because the documentary is such a form of the here and now and
yeah,
the present. It's a hyper presentist form, right? So
yeah.
anything to do with the past usually becomes difficult, and very often it becomes either maudlin or sentimental, because you're deploying techniques like reconstruction which often don't stick the landing. So
Mhm.
essentially what therefore I had to do was that, so I had interviewed them for 3 years, and I had
Mhm.
a diary full of gems of Nadeem and Saud.
What they
So
had said.
I had to use it in some way or the other. So
Yes.
So we basically decided on these lyrical voiceover sections, which, you know, invoke the past, the aura that they felt when they first saw the black kite, like their childhood, this ravenous love, you know, this kind of
Mhm.
a obsessive, ravenous, otherworldly, magical feeling that they had for the birds. So, and that's how the voiceover sections came to be.
Ah. And you also spoke somewhere of something I had not heard of, but I was very intrigued by, which is the theory of more than human.
Hmm.
That there is much more uh, importance in life than just the human being, to the animal, the babies. I mean, the birds. I mean,
Yes.
that type of, again, you call it simultaneity, and that, speak to us about that, because it's such a humbling theory in itself, and to take cinema to serve that idea is quite unusual, and yet also the only way, perhaps, like you said earlier, the only way perhaps to cull this cheek by jowl living that, especially here in India, we excel at,
Yes,
um
humbling and punctual to our times.
mhm,
Insofar as, you know, the irony, of course, is that so much of environmental discourse is incredibly, like staggeringly human oriented, right? So this started with, I mean, I also did not have, honestly, too much of a philosophical stake in this prior to this. But I was in this fellowship in the UK at Cambridge, where I was housed between people who work on human non-human relationships. And you know, I have
mhm,
a friend who teaches there called Man Barwa, who would say, "Arey, you know, you have to read this book, and you know, look at how this person thinks about the elephant, or this person thinks about the polar bear." So I was constantly within this aegis of ideas floating about, where the human
interesting.
was not the absolute reference point, you know.
Mhm,
So,
mhm,
and this decentering of the human feels more germane or more punctual to our current times, because given that so much of our current intellectual zeitgeist is about the planetary, or about, you know, the Anthropocene and all of that stuff,
yeah.
it's so much is about, but so much of environmental discourse and filmmaking especially is profoundly human centric, right? And there's some kind of a trickery that happens which I think doesn't work, which is like, you know, the classic image of one polar bear on a melting ice cap. It
Mhm,
clearly does something that, I was also fascinated by urban ecology, where
mhm,
so many animals have successful urban careers because they improvise and adjust better. And the fact that cities are
mhm,
the main driving influence of behavioral changes and evolutionary changes, really, you know, it's
mhm.
like Darwin is coming to the town. You know, it's so it's a very, like, the city is just a very fascinating way to look at non-human life. And I was also at the time reading fantastic literature which had to do with human non, you know, like H is for Hawk, or my favorite book of the lot, which is this book called The Peregrine, which is about this one man in in, I think, 1960s maybe, who in Essex in the UK, who was following peregrine falcons for about 10 years. And the book is just a diary entry of his accounts. And it's the best prose I have ever read. It is hands down. Now, I'll send you, like, Robert McFarlane wrote a review of it, which in itself is a bit of a work of art. I'll send it to you
Wow.
after. So I was reading all of this stuff. I was reading Grief is a Thing with Feathers, and, you know, so much poetry that is influenced by the avian, because you know, birds underwrite so many of our metaphors. So
Yeah.
matlab, I was completely, basically, inundated and suffused with this kind of stuff. And every time you think of Delhi and, you know, the picture postcard outside of your window right now, I mean, up to, I think it's lessened a bit because we've moved further along in the winter. But you know, it's this gray monochromatic sky and these tiny black dots gliding
Mhm.
lazily in the sky. And that's really like the classic image, as we know, right? So that's how it began. And I was very gripped by the figure of what happens when one of those black dots sort of starts falling to the sky, from the sky.
Yeah.
So essentially, that's how it began. And I feel like a lot of these, you know, so often philosophical new approaches open up or inaugurate new forms of thinking about cinema, right? And
Mhm.
that's how this sort of started. I was excited about what it meant to bring this as a point of view in filmmaking.
So, so the books in Cambridge and the kind of, I guess, a form of research or exploration that you were doing. What was it was augmented then by which cinematic heroes, if there were
Mhm.
any? Uh,
Mhm.
who
A small but a very influential litany of filmmakers. So, for
uh,
instance, Victor Kosakovsky, this documentary filmmaker, who's like cinematographically phenomenal, like phenomenal. Like
you
I've never
used
seen.
his cinematographer, right?
Yes, I did. So I
Yes.
basically wrote a love letter to Ben and said, uh, Ben, if you would be interested in shooting birds in India, and I completely like cold mailed him, and
Yeah.
and thankfully he was interested, and like we had long conversations and so on. I've just never seen panning like that. The joys
Yeah.
of one good pan in Victor Kosakovsky's films, like so often a simple pan or a tilt or something, it's so often it's technical, right? It's like hitting the marks from
Yeah.
point A to point B. But in certain films, you see one good pan that seems motivated by the elements, really, where it actually feels like hawa chal rahi hai, like the elements
Yeah.
are moving, and the camera seems to be in sync with and motivated by
Yeah.
the elements.
Yeah.
That's really a thing of rare beauty, and Kosakovsky's films have that. In terms of the editing, do you know this filmmaker called Gianfranco Rossi, documentary
Yes.
filmmaker?
Oh, he's
Yes.
great. I met him
He's
once. Yeah.
right. He's phenomenal. He's so in terms of the edit, that kind of a elliptical staccato sort of a style of
Yes.
vignettes coming and going. So
Yes.
with the edit, he was the thing, and also this film called Truffle Hunters that had come a couple of years ago, which is also. So I got the editor of Truffle Hunters actually, Charlotte,
Thanks.
who edited with our Indian editor Vedant Joshi, and so that kind of a elliptical, slightly like vignette style was super influenced by Rossi.
And working with the Kosakovsky's DP, I mean, like for instance, that first amazing shot of the the well, it's not even subterranean fully, but the rats, the surface, the dogs, the entire life that happens on our streets, and then the consciousness of the sky. um how would you do that? I mean, would you just, was it several times again and again in different places or in the same place, or how? Because there's nothing that you can predict about who emerges, who drowns, who goes from A to B. I mean, so was that just endless attempts before you found the one that was going to speak to you?
Yeah, everything in this film is really
Is
the
like that. Yeah.
yeah, because it's like endless wrecking, right? And it also becomes the truth is that
Visual wrecking. Yeah.
wrecking is also like it's seductive and it's addictive. And I feel like me and the same team of the directorial team had worked with me in the previous film also, none of
Mhm.
us have ever worked in the Bombay film industry, none of us have ever, so it's like this is all we've always done. So it's 4 or 5 of us who've went out and kept wrecking, like we were wrecking machines. And after a while you get a knack of, okay, I think the turtles come out there, or like or you figure out that there's many rats that come out at night there, and then you just endlessly shoot. None of us have any experience with wildlife, thankfully. So we weren't at all encumbered by the usual grammar baggage of it. And so the opening rat shot took about 4 nights. And but the thing about animals is just like they can endlessly frustrate you, and they're completely disregardful of what you want.
Yes.
They
Yes.
also reward you with accidents and magic, right?
Yes.
The shot of the kite taking off the glasses, I probably would not have gotten in 100 years if I shot more.
Right.
Right? But so it was an absolute miracle. Ki, the aperture was okay, the framing was okay, the exposure was okay, and somehow it just happened, right? So it essentially entailed endless wrecking. But if the especially in documentary, I feel like the process is the reward more,
Mhm.
because
Yes.
you're
You
interfacing
have to
with
enjoy that.
yeah, and the fact that it has to be a radical embrace of the unscriptedness of the world. So
Mhm.
in that, the initial period of just watching and finding images is really, I really find it usually enthralling, and so does the team. So
Mhm.
we started developing a taste for looking for elements of the city and an animal in it. And on the edit we had to kill about like 20 shots that I loved. There's a shot with a cobra that I really love. There's a shot with like different animal with bats, actually tree full of 200 bats in the Hoskas village. If you
Mhm.
ever now happen to go to the Hoskars village, there's, the lake in Hoskars, there's a tree
Mhm.
which is
Of
full of
course.
about 300 bats, and they fly out every evening. And it's like a operatic scene. Unfortunately, we couldn't get the shot right, but lots of shots like this, and basically just like spending a lot of time constantly, and everything was because of the grace of time, really.
Yeah. So, had you seen films that evoke this? Not necessarily documentary, but fiction. Had you seen? What had you seen? Books, I understand, but had you seen things besides
No,
Kozlovsky?
not besides Kosakowski so much. I think I was also interested in films like Koyaanisqatsi, and otherwise I remember just watching Stalker over and over again.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Because there's a rhythm or
Yeah,
cadence of um, tracking in a film
yeah,
like Stalker, which really, like, it has to be embedded in your head in terms of rhythm. Otherwise, you just like rush too much. It's like so it just basically patience, like examples of patience.
mhm.
So I think, yeah, somehow it was going towards Eastern Europe,
Yeah, of
cinematically.
course. Yeah, that's pretty clear. Yeah, that's pretty clear. So, just for because people will be very interested, how long did it take the course of the shoot, and did you when you shot every day? That's how I used to do it in the oldest days of the Cinema Verite and India Cabaret. Is that I would transcribe the interviews or would transcribe the what people said, the sound
Mhm,
basically
mhm.
in the night, which would kind of guide me as to what could
Yes,
happen or where I could go the next day. It
yes.
was hard work and all of that. So, what was your process in that? Because I think you took a couple of years, right, to make the
Oh,
film?
3 years, yeah. I
Three
had
years.
to every day, every night I would sit, like, so it would be about transforming, right? So if somebody said one or two things, so to find the kind of magic or enchantment in it and transform it somehow and find a more economical way of compressing
Yeah.
it.
Yes.
So taking from real material,
Yeah.
compressing it and flipping it, like transforming it
Yes.
and having more conversations that would push it towards that, and
Yeah.
therefore finding in the voiceover something that is obviously stylized and compressed, but is beautiful and economical. It's
Hmm.
like, so it had to go through the prism of something.
Hmm. That's what's so clear, that you found that prism, time and again, to so that the material became it just sort of became larger than itself. Really,
Hmm, hmm,
it was an extraordinary feeling. I've seen your film twice.
hmm.
Once in New York City, on the Academy screening room, and once here in Delhi, again just to prepare to talk with you, and to see it in Delhi was a different experience, because there's so many Delhis, and yet we do all have Hawa ki Baradari. We all breathe the same air, and and the Delhi you were filming in is literally everywhere around where I am also, and that it both burdened me, that how depraved it is, how we compartmentalize our spaces from those who don't have to those who have, and how we um, you know and how yet the air is the same, and we are all coughing, and we are all doing the same thing, and it really was a, I don't know, I couldn't quite explain to myself how I felt. I almost felt burdened that this is my Delhi, and this is the like the treasure of life here,
Hmm,
and
hmm.
how we both nourish it in the form of the brothers, and how extraordinarily selfless and thankless their task is, and yet wow, what they have to teach us, which is of how to live, how to respect, how to care, for that's next to me, but how 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 very few live like that, even with that consciousness, which is why the world is pretty much where we are at.
Yeah, I mean, to the earlier part of the question, the life is a membership,
Yeah.
and that membership is dependent on infrastructural conditions. which
Mm,
also ties us together. And whether
mhm,
we like it or not, we're part of the same club, right?
mhm,
And of course, things like class and, like you said, like compartmentalizing changes things. And it's difficult to say this without sounding a bit woo woo, but one has to sometimes focus hard on the material predicate of that membership of life. And that's what
mhm,
the brothers do so well. What I like about, unlike a lot of environmental discourse that can sometimes be a bit gloom and doom, despair, and, like lecturing you by holding you by your collar and saying, feel bad,
I know.
you know,
Yeah,
the brothers have a kind of like slow, wry resilience,
yeah,
and a kind of the birds are falling down. You have to put your head down and get on with it. And they felt to me like three Don Quixotes, just like, trafficking in micro miracles. And it felt a lot like they suggested a new philosophical disposition to think of
they
climate change
did.
and the planet and all of that, right? Because it's both influenced by a non-scientific genealogy of things, which comes from the world of folklore and myth and,
Mhm,
spirits and all of that from their mom, while at the same time they're very scientifically attuned. So all of those things together presented a very fresh kind of a
mhm,
perspective that seemed like something that I hadn't encountered before.
mhm,
And it
mhm,
felt like, if there was to be a kind of a version or one snippet of a non-Western genealogy of
mhm,
thinking about care and non-human life and
mhm,
entanglement and, these broader planetary issues, then this felt like a very interesting kind of a way to think about it. So, I
mhm,
mean, I wasn't sure of how the West would take it.
mhm,
So I'm actually relieved that like even people outside of our heritage of ideas have also taken
mhm.
to the film. So that's a pleasant surprise.
And how did you get support from the film from its inception? How did you find this kind of support for this way of seeing, which is a very extraordinarily original way of seeing and not particularly palatable sometimes to the
Yes.
commercial taste of
Yes, and
everything,
not
of
cheap, right?
viewing?
Not cheap too. I mean, in contrast to my previous film, this film, which was like really like it's the shoestringest of the poorest
Yeah,
shoes, of the most ragged shoes. So it was like almost no money. My previous film, and this film, of course, we needed more resources because we needed the luxury of time. So it initially started with the way a lot of these films start, which is grants and grants from Sundance and IDFA and Tribeca and Catapult and so on. And so it was initially just like on that early lease of life that a grant provides you. And initially, like as I mean, it's probably been decades since you had to do this, but
the
you
different
start
versions
off
of the
by being
same.
a come on, please. You have to start off by being a professional grant writer, then a
Yeah,
filmmaker.
that's what
So
I.
it's that's how it began. And then after that you become a pitching machine in a variety of pitching forums, and you figure out your 3-minute pitch and you keep pitching. And then finally we met our wonderful producers from the UK, Teddy Leifer and Rice Films, and then our American studio who work with science related things, and that's how it started. But
Yeah,
basically for the first year we didn't have almost any money. Second year we had some money. Third year we were well stocked. But
yeah.
initially it was really me and my close friend and producer Aman, who were he was doing sound, I was doing camera for the first year, and a couple of other assistants who worked with us from previous films.
I'm being told we're soon out of time, so
Mhm.
I'm just plain curious as to what you're cooking up next and what you're thinking of. Maybe not something fixed, but I'd just love to know what is
I, the thing
processing,
is,
if anything.
maybe I need to take your advice on this afterwards at some point whenever we meet.
Yeah,
I, I'm a slow thinker, so it takes me time to marinate, and and
yeah,
the thing is that right now the last few months have been just so discombobulating, and it's a relentless treadmill of just flights. You know how it is, right? So
yes. Sure.
I haven't had the time to think. So, but I do want to do something which can vaguely be called that it's vaguely be put as the ecological sublime. So,
Mm-hmm.
in continuation from what I'm like doing in a more zoomed out scale with this film, but I don't know. I mean, I'm also interested in fiction as much, and
Mm-hmm.
so I don't know, but I don't have a. I feel terrible that every time somebody says, "What is
Yeah,
next?" I
makes
don't have
sense.
set answer to give. But after this, I will unplug for a bit, go off the grid
Yeah.
for a
Yeah.
couple of months and write something out. That's the plan.
Yeah. Shaunak, thank you very, very much for an extraordinary vision of this world and of your film and of how you see it and the portraits you've made, not just of our city, but also of our oblivion to what is happening in the world right around us and we don't see. And I just have really been struck by it and moved by it. And I think of it as a meditation, really, of how one could live actually. And I'm also in Nizamuddin. Every morning the kites just swirl.
Yes.
It's, the bird life. It starts
Yes.
with the
Yes.
parrots, it goes to the crows, then the kites come. And the
Yes.
kites are my companions. And now, because of your film, I am completely, like, sort of look at them with great, great care and respect and obsession, because they teach me that one could fly despite the struggles of the world. Anyway, so I just wanted to thank you because you're a real filmmaker, and it's such a cinematic tour de force, to that, just without preaching, without being cloying, without being nice, you're telling us how we have to live and how the world has to live and keep on breathing. So I just want to thank you deeply, and I look forward so much to any of your future work. And I'm going back to find Cities of Sleep.
Thank you so much, Mira. Thank you. This was a real honor.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Shaunak.